I was the Silverstone Pack's greatest shame, a daughter of alphas who couldn't find her growl. My reckless choice wasn't just refusing to marry the alpha of the Gold Leaf Pack, it was doing it by dumping a tureen of cold leek soup into his lap in front of the entire High Council, while telling him his breath smelled like wet dog. I was already the pack disgrace, but that bowl of soup transformed me into a peace offering. Now I'm standing at the Iron Spine border as my father's carriage peels away into the fog. They think they're throwing me to the wolves to be shredded. Chapter 1. The Verdict of Silence. You could at least try to look like you're going to miss me, I said, eyeing the way my father was already mentally redecorating my bedroom into a study for my more competent brothers. I adjusted my velvet traveling cloak, making sure the silver clasp was perfectly centered. If I was going to be the pack disgrace being hauled off to the border of the Iron Spine territory, I was going to do it looking spectacular. My father, the alpha of the Silverstone Pack, didn't look up from the map on the mahogany table. He looked like he was trying to solve a particularly annoying math problem, and unfortunately, I was the variable he was subtracting. Thalia, you are a liability. You have no scent, no wolf, and after the incident with the soup, you have no future here. Be grateful Rhodri is willing to take a tribute at all. The soup was a creative critique, father. The Gold Leaf Alpha needed to know that his marriage proposal was as tasteless as his chef's seasoning, I replied, though the humor felt like swallowing a handful of dry needles. The Silverstone Hall was filled with the elite of our lineage, all of them standing in their 19th century finery, smelling of pine and judgment. My oldest brother, the favored heir, stood by the massive oak doors, a smirk playing on his lips. He was the golden boy. I was the girl who liked poetry more than pouncing. "The carriage is ready," my brother announced, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. "The rogue is waiting at the border. He hasn't had a tribute in a decade. I wonder if he'll even know what to do with a girl who can't even growl." I walked toward him, my head held so high my neck was starting to ache. "Oh, I'm sure Rhodri will find something to do with me, brother. Perhaps I'll teach him how to properly tie a cravat. Lord knows someone needs to teach the men in this family a bit of style." My brother's smirk vanished. He didn't like it when I didn't cower. I was supposed to be the disgrace. I was supposed to be shaking. But as I stepped onto the gravel path toward the black carriage, the gravity of it hit me. I wasn't just being moved, I was being erased. The carriage ride was 4 hours of bone-jarring silence as we climbed toward the Iron Spine border. The air grew colder, the scent of the forest deepening into something dark, heavy, and intoxicating. It didn't smell like the cultivated gardens of my home. It smelled like raw earth, wet stone, and something primal. When the carriage finally lurched to a halt, the driver didn't even open the door for me. He just unlatched the trunk, tossed my single suitcase into the mud, and whipped the horses into a frenzy to get away. I stood there, my boots sinking into the muck of the neutral zone. The storm was just beginning. The clouds overhead a bruised, heavy purple. And then I saw him. He didn't come with a roar. He simply stepped out from behind a towering cedar tree, a man so large he seemed to block out the very sky. He was shirtless in the freezing rain, his skin a map of jagged scars, and his eyes, dark, obsidian, and utterly human, locked onto mine. The greatest enemy. He didn't move. He just stood there, letting the rain slick his dark hair back, his nostrils flaring as he caught my scent. My heart hammered a frantic, rhythmic dance against my ribs, but I didn't look away. I reached down, picked up my muddy skirts, and took a step toward him. "I suppose you're the one I meant to appease," I said, my voice barely a whisper against the wind. He didn't speak. He just walked toward me, his movements slow and heavy, until he was close enough that I could feel the searing heat radiating off his skin. He reached out, a hand larger than my entire face hovering just inches from my cheek. I didn't flinch. I leaned into his space, my breath hitching as I caught the scent of wood smoke and something dark and addictive. "Well," I challenged, my voice shaking just a little, "are you going to eat me, or are you going to show me where you keep the dry blankets?" His fingers finally touched my skin, and the world didn't just stop, it shattered. Chapter 2: The Cedar Bastion. The world didn't just shatter, it tilted on its axis. When Rhodri's calloused thumb grazed my cheek, I expected the cold sting of a predator's claws. Instead, I was met with a heat so intense it felt like standing too close to a blacksmith's forge. His hand was a map of his life, rough, scarred, and overwhelmingly large, but the way he touched me was hesitant. He wasn't looking at me like I was a tribute or a disgrace. He was looking at me like I was a miracle he didn't quite believe in. His pupils were so blown that the dark obsidian swallowed the iris entirely, and for a second, the only sound in the rain-drenched neutral zone was the frantic, uneven rhythm of his breathing. "You're shivering," he said. His voice wasn't a growl, but a low, subterranean rumble that vibrated through the soles of my boots and settled deep in my bones. It was the sound of earth moving, of roots snapping. "It's the dress," I managed to say, my teeth chattering despite the fire in my blood. "Silk is remarkably poor at insulating against the greatest enemy's weather, and I believe my suitcase is currently becoming a permanent part of the local ecosystem." I gestured to my trunk, which was half buried in the muck. Rhodri didn't look at the suitcase. He didn't even blink. Before I could register his movement, he reached down and scooped me up. One arm hooked under my knees, the other behind my back, and suddenly I was being carried through the storm as if I weighed no more than a bundle of dry kindling. "Put me down, I can walk," I protested, though my hands instinctively found his bare, wet shoulders. He was like stone, but warmer. "I was told you were a rogue, not a carriage service." "The mud is deep," Rhodri replied, his stride effortless as he moved through the dense cedar forest. "And you have spent enough time in the dirt today, Thalia." The way he said my name, low and heavy, like a secret, made my stomach do a slow, traitorous flip. I leaned my head against his shoulder, catching the scent of him. It wasn't the metallic, aggressive musk of the Silverstone alphas. It was wood smoke, rain-drenched earth, and a dark, addictive spice that made my mind go hazy. We crested a small rise, and a massive cabin loomed out of the fog. It was built of dark, heavy timber, a bastion of cedar that looked like it had grown out of the mountain itself. Rhodri didn't slow down. He kicked the heavy oak door open, carried me into the sudden, sweltering warmth of the interior, and let me slide down his body until my feet hit the rug. The door slammed shut behind us, the iron bolt clicking into place with a finality that made the air in the room feel twice as thick. Rhodri stood between me and the exit, his shirtless frame glistening with rain in the orange light of the hearth. He loomed over me, his chest heaving, his gaze fixed on my mouth with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "Now," he breathed, taking a step toward me until I was backed against the warm wood of the door. "Tell me why they really threw you away." Chapter 3: The Monster's Wardrobe. I looked up at him, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Rhodri was a wall of muscle, a rogue who had survived 10 years of exile, and here I was, the girl who couldn't even growl, trapped in his sanctuary. "They threw me away because I was an inconvenience," I said, my voice gaining strength as I remembered the smirk on my brother's face. "The Silverstone pack prefers their women to be loud, aggressive, and easily controlled. I am none of those things. I'm a disgrace because I don't fit into their narrow little boxes." Rhodri's nostrils flared. He leaned in, his nose brushing against my temple as he inhaled deeply. "They are fools," he rasped. "You don't smell like a disgrace. You smell like a beginning." The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of my collarbone, careful as if he were handling a piece of rare porcelain. "You are soaked to the bone. If I let you catch a chill, I'll have to spend my winter nursing a human, and I am a very impatient man." I noticed. The way you manhandled me through the forest was a masterclass in subtlety. If you're so worried, perhaps you could point me toward a dressing room, or is the monster of the marches too primitive for partitions? Rhodri's lips quirked, a ghost of a smile that transformed his rugged face into something devastatingly handsome. He turned and walked toward a heavy cedar wardrobe, pulling out a bundle of thick cream-colored wool. "There's a screen by the fire," he said, gesturing to a folding partition carved from dark wood. "Change. These were my mother's. She was smaller than me." He handed me the clothes. The wool was soft, high quality, and smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. As our fingers brushed during the exchange, a jolt of pure biological heat snapped between us. Rhodri froze, his eyes locking onto mine, his grip on the fabric tightening. The mate pull was no longer a theory. It was a physical cord, dragging us together until the air between us felt like it was vibrating. "Thalia," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly growl. "I'm changing," I said, my voice breathy. I snatched the clothes and scurried behind the screen. As I peeled off the silk wet, I could hear him moving around the cabin, the heavy thud of logs being added to the fire, the clink of a kettle. Every sound felt amplified. I pulled the wool tunic over my head. It was oversized, falling nearly to my knees, making me feel small and cherished. When I stepped out from behind the screen, the fire was roaring, and Rhodri was standing by the hearth, his back to me. His muscles rippled under the firelight, the scars on his back telling a story of 100 battles I couldn't imagine. He turned around, and the mug he was holding nearly slipped from his hand. He stared at me in his mother's clothes, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "Better?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant, while my skin felt like it was on fire. "Worse," he choked out. He set the mug on the mantel and took a predatory step towards me. "Much, much worse." Chapter 4. The Anchor Scent. The silence in the cabin wasn't empty, it was pressurized. Rhodri's gaze moved over me with a slow, heavy deliberation that made my knees feel like they were made of water. He wasn't just looking, he was claiming. "You look like a queen in rags," he said, his voice dropping to that subterranean rumble. "And you look like a man who hasn't had a proper conversation in a decade," I retorted, though I was practically vibrating with the biological pull between us. "If you keep staring at me like that, Rhodri, I might start to think you're actually glad the Silverstone pack threw me away." "Glad?" Rhodri let out a sharp, dry laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Thalia, I've been watching the border for 3 months. I didn't wait for a tribute. I waited for you." I froze. "You what?" "Your scent," he said, stepping closer until the heat of his body was a second skin. "The wind carries it. Even when you were miles away, locked in your father's house, I could smell the iron and the sweetness. My wolf has been pacing this mountain since the first time you walked into the Silverstone Gardens. They think they discarded you. I think they gave me the only thing worth having in this entire territory." The pack disgrace label I had worn like a shroud suddenly felt absurd. To my father, I was a liability. To Rhodri, I was an obsession he had been tracking for months. He reached out, his hand tangling in my damp, loose hair, pulling my head back just enough so I had to look up at him. "I am a rogue, Thalia. I have no pack, no title, and my only law is the mountain. he whispered, his breath fanning over my lips. "But I will give you a throne made of cedar and fir if it means you never look at that border again." "I have no intention of looking back," I said, my voice fierce, as I grabbed the front of his shirt, or would have if he were wearing one. Instead, my fingers curled against the hard, hot muscle of his chest. My human heart was racing, but my spirit was soaring. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being tolerated, I was being worshipped by a monster. "I don't want quiet," he groaned, his head dipping toward my neck, inhaling as if he were trying to pull my very soul into his lungs. I leaned back, my eyes closing as a wave of pure romantic heat washed over me. But then, a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed against the cabin floor, not from us, but from the cellar below, a sound of something heavy, something alive, trying to get out. Rhodri went bone still, his growl turning from a purr to a warning. "Stay here," he commanded, his eyes snapping to the cellar door. "Don't move." Chapter 5. The Basement Hobbies. "Don't move," he'd said, as if I'd spent 20 years being the Silverstone Pack's favorite floor scrubber just to start taking orders from a man who didn't even own a shirt. I waited exactly 3 seconds after the cellar door creaked shut behind Rhodri's massive frame before I followed. My father had called me a liability because I lacked the killer instinct, but apparently I possessed a very healthy dose of reckless curiosity. I grabbed a heavy iron candle snuffer from the mantel. It wasn't a knife, but it had enough weight to give someone a very focused headache, and crept toward the stairs. The cellar didn't smell like damp earth or rotting apples. It smelled like ancient pine and a biological musk so heavy it felt like walking through a cloud of velvet. Rhodri was standing in the center of a stone-walled chamber, his back to me, his muscles corded like iron cables. In front of him, behind a heavy iron grate, was the source of the thumping. It wasn't a monster. It was a wolf, the largest I had ever seen, its fur the color of charcoal, its eyes wide and panicked. It was a wild-born rogue, trapped and thrashing against the stone. "Rhodri," I whispered. He spun around, his expression shifting from a snarl to a look of pure, agonizing worry. "Thalia, I told you to stay above. He's wild. He doesn't know the law of the mate." "Neither do I, apparently, and he isn't wild. He's terrified. He smells like he's been caught in a trap for a week." "Stay back," Rhodri commanded, his voice dropping to a low, warning rumble. "He'll snap at anything that smells like a pack wolf." "Good thing I smell like nothing, then," I countered, my voice laced with the dry humor that usually got me locked in the Silverstone laundry room. I ignored Rhodri's reaching hand and knelt by the iron bars. The charcoal wolf lunged, his teeth snapping inches from my face. Rhodri lunged forward to haul me back, but I held up a hand. I didn't growl. I didn't show my teeth. I simply leaned my forehead against the iron bars and exhaled, letting my human sweet scent, the one my father hated, pour into the cage. The wolf froze. His nostrils flared, twitching as he caught the iron and honey of my blood. The thrashing stopped. The low, guttural growl died in his throat, replaced by a confused, high-pitched whimper. I reached through the bars, my fingers brushing the charcoal fur. Rhodri was frozen behind me, his breath hitched in his throat, his biological protective instinct warring with the sheer impossible reality of what he was seeing. "See?" I said, looking back at Rhodri with a fierce, triumphant smile. "He doesn't want to eat me. He wants someone to acknowledge that he's hurting." Rhodri took a step toward me, his eyes dark with a new kind of reverence. He wasn't looking at a tribute anymore. He was looking at a force of nature. He dropped to his knees beside me, his large hand covering mine on the iron bars. "You are not a disgrace," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You are a sovereign. You have the scent that stops the wild." He leaned in, his lips hovering over the shell of my ear, his heat making the cold cellar feel like a summer afternoon. But if you ever scare me like that again, Thalia, I'm going to have to find a way to keep you very, very busy so you don't have time for heroics. Is that a threat, Rhodri? I asked, my heart thumping against my ribs. It's a promise, he groaned, his hand sliding from the bars to the nape of my neck. But as he pulled me closer, a sharp metallic clink echoed from the top of the stairs. The front door hadn't just been bolted, someone was trying to pick the lock. Chapter 6. The Intruder's Scent. The romantic haze of the cellar vanished instantly. Rhodri was on his feet before I could even blink, his rogue instincts snapping into place. He didn't shift, he didn't need to. He stood there, a wall of scarred muscle, his head tilted as he scented the air coming from the vents. Silverstone, he spat, the name sounding like a curse. Your brother didn't just drop you at the border, he followed the trail. Of course he did, I muttered, pushing myself up from the cold stone floor. Cedric never could resist a chance to see me suffer. He probably brought a picnic to watch the monster shred me. Rhodri's eyes flashed with a dark, territorial heat. He grabbed my waist, hauling me flush against him. The mate pull was so strong now, it felt like our skin was trying to fuse together. He won't see you suffer. He won't even see your face if I have my way. Hide in the back of the chamber, behind the wolf. Hide? I arched an eyebrow, my voice dripping with the fierce pride I'd been cultivating since I realized my father was a fool. Rhodri, I've been hiding in the shadows of the Silverstone Hall for 20 years. I didn't come to your mountain to hide in a basement. If my brother is at that door, he needs to see exactly what he threw away. Thalia, this isn't a game, Rhodri growled, his hands tightening on my hips. This isn't a game. If they see you like this, if they see that you've claimed this territory, they won't just leave. They'll try to rescue you to sell you to another pack. Then let them try, I said, reaching up to grip his forearms. His skin was burning, his pulse racing under my fingertips. They think I'm a disgrace. Let them see me as a queen. It'll be much more embarrassing for them. Rhodri stared at me, his throat working as he swallowed his protective rage. The power dynamic was shifting. He wanted to hoard me, to keep me safe and silent, but he could see the iron in my gaze. He let out a low, defeated purr and pressed his forehead against mine. You are going to be the death of my peace, aren't you? I certainly hope so, I replied. We moved up the stairs, the sound of the lockpicking growing more frantic. Rhodri stood behind me as I reached for the bolt. He was so close I could feel the vibration of his low, constant growl against my back. It was a sound of absolute possession. I threw the bolt back and yanked the door open. My brother, Cedric, was standing there, with 2 enforcers, a silver lockpick set in his hand, and a smug, rehearsed expression on his face. He looked like he was ready to deliver a eulogy. When he saw me standing there, wearing Rhodri's mother's fine wool and radiating a calm, terrifying authority, his jaw didn't just drop, it practically hit the porch. Thalia, he stammered, his eyes darting to the massive, scarred man looming behind me. You're alive? We thought, the rogue. The rogue has a name, Cedric, I said, stepping onto the porch, the freezing wind catching my hair. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like the woman who owned the mountain. And he has much better manners than you do. Now, unless you've come to apologize for the mud, I suggest you turn that carriage around before my mate decides you're trespassing. The word mate hit the Silverstone wolves like a physical blow. The biological scent of our claim was now so thick it was unmistakable. Cedric's face went from pale to a mottled, ugly purple. Mate? He hissed. You can't be his mate. You're a human-smelling fluke. You're a disgrace. Rhodri stepped forward, his hand resting on the small of my back. He didn't roar, he just looked at Cedric with the eyes of a man who had survived 10 years of hell and was looking for a reason to start another one. Chapter 7. The Labor of the Mate. The silence on the porch was so heavy it felt like it might crack the floorboards. Cedric looked at me, then at the scarred monster behind me, and finally at the way Rhodri's hand was splayed across my waist in a gesture of total, unyielding possession. "This is an insult to the Silverstone lineage," Cedric spat, though he took a strategic step back toward the carriage. "Father will hear of this. He'll have the High Council revoke your name entirely. You'll be nothing but a rogue's pet." "Cedric," I said, my voice as cold as the frost on the trees. "I was already nothing to you. Now I am everything to him. I think I've made a remarkably good trade. Now leave, before I ask Rhodri to show you exactly how he treats people who interrupt our dinner." Rhodri let out a low, vibrating growl that made Cedric's horses whinny in terror. My brother didn't wait for a second warning. He scrambled into the carriage, shouting at the driver to move. I watched them disappear into the fog, the sound of the wheels fading until the mountain was silent once again. I let out a long, shaky breath, the fierce mask slipping just for a second. The weight of the rejection was finally, truly over. Rhodri didn't say a word. He just picked me up, again, and carried me back inside, kicking the door shut. He didn't put me down. He carried me over to the hearth, where the fire had settled into a deep, pulsing red. He sat in the oversized cedar chair he'd carved himself and kept me in his lap, his arms wrapping around me like iron bands. "You called me your mate," he whispered, his face buried in my neck. "I call things as I see them, Rhodri, and unless you're planning on returning me to the laundry room, I think the label fits." He let out a sound, half purr, half sob, and held me tighter. "I am going to build you a kingdom, Thalia. I will hunt for you, I will keep the fire for you, and I will make sure the Silverstone pack never breathes your air again. That is my labor." For the next few hours, I watched as the greatest enemy became my most devoted servant. He didn't use magic, he used his hands. He brought me warm cider. He stoked the fire until the cabin was a sweltering sanctuary of romance. And he even brought out a brush made of boar bristles to untangle the knots the storm had left in my hair. The intimacy was staggering. The way he brushed my hair, careful, rhythmic, and slow, felt more scandalous than any kiss. Every stroke was a confession. Every time his knuckles brushed my scalp, a wave of biological heat rolled through me. "You're purring," I teased, leaning my head back against his chest. "I am a rogue, Thalia. I have forgotten how to be anything but a beast," he rasped, his eyes fixed on the fire. "But with you, I feel like I might remember how to be a man." He set the brush down and turned me around in his lap so I was facing him. The orange firelight played over the jagged scars on his chest, but his eyes were soft, full of a raw, romantic vulnerability. He reached out, his thumb tracing my lower lip. "I want to show you the peak tomorrow. I want to show you where the world ends and our territory begins." "Our territory?" I asked, my heart skipping. "Ours," he promised. But as I leaned in to finally close the gap between our lips, a low, melodic whistle echoed from the woods. It wasn't a bird, it was a signal, the sound of a rogue pack, Rhodri's old enemies, circling the cabin. Chapter 8. The Ghost of the Marches. That melodic whistle didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a memory Rhodri had spent a decade trying to bury. He went from being my devoted, cider-serving mate to a pillar of predatory tension in the heartbeat it took for the sound to fade. "Stay behind the heavy timber," he rasped, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. "Oh, absolutely not," I said, setting my cider mug down with a deliberate thunk on the cedar table. If your old friends have come to serenade us, I'd like to at least offer them a critique of their pitch. Besides, if I hide every time someone whistles, I'll spend half my life in the pantry. Rhodri turned, a growl vibrating so deep in his chest it made the floorboards hum. Thalia, those aren't Silverstone puppies. Those are rogues, men who have forgotten the difference between a hunt and a slaughter. Then it's a good thing they're facing a woman who spent 20 years being the smartest person in a room full of idiots, I replied, smoothing out the cream wool of my tunic. I walked over to him, placing my hand on the corded muscle of his forearm. The heat was dizzying, a constant reminder of the biological tether pulling at my very soul. You are going to be the reason I lose my mind, aren't you? I certainly hope so. Now let's go say hello. We stepped onto the porch together. The air was thick with the scent of wet pine and the sharp, metallic tang of the rogues. 4 men stood at the edge of the clearing, their clothes ragged, their eyes reflecting the dim orange light from our windows like shards of broken glass. They weren't armed with steel. Their weapons were their own raw, untamed presence. The leader, a man with hair the color of bone, stepped forward. Rhodri, we heard the border was open. We heard you'd finally taken a tribute from the Silverstone weaklings. We came to see if the monster had grown soft. Rhodri didn't move. He didn't roar. He simply stood behind me, his hand resting on my waist, projecting a wave of dominant biological authority that felt like a physical wall. The air in the clearing became pressurized, the mate claim so potent it made the rogues flinch. She isn't a tribute, Rhodri said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried across the snow. She is the sovereign of this mountain, and you are trespassing on her air. I took a step forward, the freezing wind whipping my hair across my face. I didn't look like a disgraced daughter. I looked like the woman who had tamed the storm. You heard him. The border isn't open. It's closed to anyone who doesn't know how to bow. Now, unless you'd like to experience exactly how soft my mate has become while protecting what's his, I suggest you vanish. The bone-haired man looked at me, then at Rhodri, and finally at the sheer, unyielding heat radiating between us. He could smell it, the iron, the honey, and the absolute submission of a rogue alpha to a woman who couldn't even growl. He didn't fight. He couldn't. The biological weight of our bond was an apex force. He nodded once, a gesture of terrified respect, and the 4 men vanished into the trees like smoke. Rhodri let out a long, ragged breath and pulled me back into the warmth of the cabin. He didn't stop at the door. He pinned me against the cedar wall, his face buried in my neck, his heart thundering against mine. Thalia, he groaned, his voice thick with a raw, romantic hunger. I need to take you to the peak, now. Chapter 9. The Sovereign Heights. The journey to the peak wasn't a walk, it was a pilgrimage. Rhodri carried me most of the way, his stride effortless as he scaled the jagged, frost-covered rocks of the iron spine. I had my arms wrapped tightly around his neck, my face pressed into the heat of his shoulder. Every time his skin brushed mine, a jolt of pure, addictive energy surged through me, a biological mate ache that demanded more than just proximity. We're high enough, I whispered, the air thinning as we reached the summit. Rhodri set me down on a flat, obsidian-dark plateau that overlooked the entire territory. To the south, the flickering lights of the Silverstone pack looked like tiny, insignificant sparks. To the north, the endless, untamed wilderness stretched into infinity. This is it, Rhodri said, his voice carrying a heavy, emotional weight. This is where the world ends, and we begin. The wind was biting, but I didn't feel the cold. The heat radiating from Rhodri was a furnace, his protective musk wrapping around me like a heavy velvet cloak. I walked to the very edge of the plateau, looking down at the kingdom we had claimed in less than 48 hours. They called me a disgrace because I didn't have a wolf's voice, I said, my voice clear and fierce against the wind. They thought silence was weakness. They didn't realize it was just the quiet before the storm. Rhodri stepped up behind me, his chest flush against my back, his arms encircling me. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of the mountain and the woman who now owned it. "Your silence is the most powerful thing I've ever heard, Talia," he rasped. "My wolf, he doesn't want a warrior, he wants a queen who can stop his heart with a look, and you've done that since the moment you stepped into the mud." He turned me around in his arms, his eyes searching mine. The intimacy of the heights was staggering. Up here, away from the cabin and the cages, there was nothing but the raw biological pull of the bond. "I want to make a vow to you," he said, his voice dropping to a low, reverent whisper. "Not a pack vow, not a legal contract, a blood and bone promise. I will never let another hand touch you. I will never let another scent offend you. I am your shield, your servant, and your shadow." He dropped to one knee on the frozen stone, baring his throat to me in the ultimate act of shifter submission. The monster of the marches, the man the entire territory feared, was kneeling at the feet of the woman they had thrown away. I reached down, my fingers tracing the jagged scars on his neck. "And I vow to be the anchor you've been searching for. No more exile, Rhodri. No more rogue life. We are our own pack now." He let out a sound, a deep, vibrating purr that resonated through the stone beneath our feet. He rose and pulled me into a kiss that tasted of frost and fire, a seal on a bond that defied every law of the shifter world. But as we pulled apart, gasping for air in the thin altitude, the ground beneath us didn't just vibrate, it buckled. A low, rhythmic thumping, identical to the one in the cellar, echoed from the very heart of the mountain. Chapter 10. The Mountain's Pulse. The thumping wasn't a monster, it was the mountain itself. Or rather, it was the hidden chambers beneath the iron spine, a labyrinth of ancient geothermal vents that Rhodri had used to keep his cabin warm for a decade. But today, the rhythm was different. It was frantic, matching the rapid, synchronized beat of our hearts. "The vents are shifting," Rhodri said, his brow furrowed in a mix of confusion and instinctual alarm. He grabbed my hand, his grip firm but careful. "The bond, Thalia, the mountain is reacting to us." "Don't tell me my father was right and I am magical," I joked, though my breath hitched as another shudder rocked the plateau. "It's not magic," Rhodri replied, pulling me toward the path back down. "The iron spine is a sensitive range. Large shifters, strong bonds, the energy has to go somewhere. We need to get back to the cabin. The cellar will be the safest place if the rock starts to slide." We moved down the mountain with a speed that made my head spin. Rhodri didn't just carry me, he moved as if we were a single unit, our movements perfectly in sync. By the time we reached the cedar bastion, the air was humming with a low-frequency vibration that made my teeth ache. Inside, the cabin was a sweltering sanctuary. The heat from the hearth had tripled, fueled by the geothermal surge below. Rhodri immediately went to the cellar door, checking the charcoal wolf we'd left behind. The animal was calm, lying flat against the stone, its eyes fixed on the ceiling. "He knows," Rhodri whispered. "He's waiting for the peak to pass." Rhodri turned back to me, his shirtless frame glistening with a fine sheen of sweat. The mate ache was reaching a fever pitch. Every inch of my skin felt sensitized, craving the touch of his hands, the weight of his body. "Talia," he said, his voice a ragged confession. I spent 10 years building this place to be a fortress. I thought I was protecting myself from the world. I didn't realize I was just building a nursery for the man I was supposed to become for you. He walked over to the large cedar chair and sat, pulling me into his lap with an urgency that stole my breath. He didn't just hold me, he worshipped me. He began to unpin my hair, the boar bristle brush moving in slow, rhythmic strokes that felt like a physical seduction. "You're doing it again," I murmured, my eyes closing as the brush smoothed over my scalp. "The labor of the mate. You're going to spoil me, Rhodri." "Good," he growled softly, his lips grazing my jawline. "I want you so spoiled that the very thought of the Silverstone pack makes you laugh. I want you to forget they ever existed." The intimacy was absolute. In the glowing heat of the cabin, with the mountain thrumming beneath us, we were the only two people in the universe. Rhodri's devotion was a tangible force, a physical weight that pressed me into his chest. "I've already forgotten them," I promised, turning in his lap to face him. "You gave me a verdict of silence, but you gave me a kingdom." I reached out, tracing the line of his collarbone, my heart swelling with a fierce, protective love for the monster who had saved me. But as I leaned in to seal the promise with a kiss, the heavy oak door didn't just rattle, it was struck by a force so powerful the iron bolt snapped like a dry twig. The door flew open, and a single blood-stained letter fluttered onto the rug, carried by a wind that smelled of Silverstone treachery. Chapter 11. The Hearth Queen. The letter didn't just flutter, it practically throbbed with the stench of the Silverstone pack. It was the scent of stale ozone and arrogant entitlement, a perfume I'd spent 20 years trying to scrub out of my skin. Rhodri was off the cedar chair before I could blink, his body a shield of heated muscle between me and the parchment. "Don't touch it," he growled, the sound vibrating through the very soles of my feet. "I have eyes, Rhodri. I can see the blood," I said, stepping around his massive frame with a dry, humorless laugh. Though knowing my father, he probably just pricked his finger on a fountain pen and decided to make it look dramatic for the pack disgrace. He always did have a flair for the theatrical. I reached down and snatched the letter from the rug. Rhodri let out a sharp, warning hiss, but he didn't stop me. He stood over me, his shadow swallowing the room, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air for any hidden threats. The mate pole was a roar in my ears, now a biological demand to lean into him, to let him handle the world while I stayed safe. But I wasn't a tribute anymore. I was the woman who had tamed the charcoal wolf in the cellar. I unfolded the heavy cream-colored paper. "Thalia," the script read, elegant and cold. "The Iron Spine is no place for a daughter of my blood. Your rogue has 3 days to deliver you to the southern reach. If you are not there, we will not come for a rescue. We will come for a clearing. The mountain will be silent once again." "A clearing," I whispered, the word tasting like ash. He's threatening to burn the territory. He'd rather ash the forest than let me exist outside his control. Rhodri's reaction wasn't a roar. It was a terrifying, absolute silence. He took the letter from my hand, his fingers trembling with a rage so potent it made the air in the cabin feel like it was ionizing. He crumpled the paper into a ball, and for a second, I thought he might actually crush the stone of the hearth with his bare hands. "He thinks I am a rogue he can dictate terms to," Rhodri rasped, his eyes turning a dark, dangerous obsidian. "He thinks you are a piece of property he can recall when the whim strikes him." "He's a fool, Rhodri," I said, reaching up to cup his face. His skin was burning, his pulse a frantic staccato against my palms. "He thinks he's the alpha of everything. He doesn't realize he's just a man who's about to lose his best chance at peace." "I will kill them all," Rhodri promised, his voice a low, subterranean vibration. "I will tear the Silverstone pack apart before they set a single foot on your mountain." No, I said, my voice sharp and fierce. We're not going to kill anyone. That's exactly what he expects. He wants a monster to justify his fire. We're not going to give him a monster, Rhodri. We're going to give him a queen. We're going to reorganize this cabin, reinforce the cellar, and show him that his disgrace has built a kingdom he couldn't survive for an hour. Rhodri stared at me, the predatory heat in his eyes flickering with a new kind of awe. He dropped his head, pressing his forehead against mine, his breath fanning over my lips in ragged gasps. "You want to lead them into a trap?" he whispered. "No," I replied, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. "Now get more wood. The mountain is thrumming, the air is freezing, and if my father is coming in 3 days, I want this cabin to be so sweltering and romantic it makes his head spin." Rhodri let out a low, defeated purr, his hand sliding to the nape of my neck. But as he pulled me in for a kiss that tasted of iron and honey, the cellar door didn't just rattle. The charcoal wolf inside let out a howl of pure, agonized warning. Chapter 12. The Fever Snap. The charcoal wolf's howl was the final thread in the tension that had been building since I stepped into the mud. The mountain was thrumming, the letter was a death threat, and my biological bond with the man standing over me had reached a fever pitch that was making my very skin ache. "He's reacting to the stress," Rhodri rasped, his hands gripping my waist with an intensity that threatened to bruise. "Thalia, the mountain, the wolf, it's all connected to the mate pull. It's too much. The energy is seeking a snap." "Then let it snap," I said, my voice breathy and fierce. I didn't wait for him to lead. I grabbed the front of his buckskin trousers, since he still refused to wear a shirt, and hauled him toward the large cedar chair by the fire. I wasn't the quiet servant of the Silverstone pack anymore. I was the sovereign of the iron spine, and I was claiming my own. Rhodri fell into the chair, taking me with him, his arms wrapping around me like iron bands. The heat in the cabin was staggering now, a sweltering, airless sanctuary of musk and cedar. He buried his face in my neck, his nostrils flaring as he inhaled the scent of my skin, that nothing scent that was currently making him lose his mind. I can't breathe without you," he groaned, his voice a ragged confession against my pulse point. "Thalia, I spent 10 years in the dark. I didn't know I was waiting for this. I didn't know I was waiting for you to tell me who I was." "You were always this man, Rhodri," I said, my fingers tangling in his dark, damp hair. "You just needed someone who wasn't afraid to look at the scars." The intimacy was raw, physical, and devoid of any magical light. It was just the sound of the crackling fire, the heavy thud of the charcoal wolf in the cellar, and the frantic, synchronized rhythm of our hearts. Every time Rhodri's lips touched my skin, a wave of heat rolled through me, a biological mate ache that made me feel like I was finally, truly alive. He began to unlace the back of my tunic, his large, calloused fingers moving with a painstaking care that made me want to scream with impatience. He wasn't just undressing me, he was worshipping me. Every inch of skin he revealed was met with a low, vibrating purr that resonated through my entire body. "They called you a disgrace," he whispered, his eyes dark with a worshipful hunger as he looked at me in the orange firelight. "They had the most precious thing in the world, and they threw it away because they couldn't control it." "I'm not a thing, Rhodri," I said, leaning in to brush my lips against his. "And I'm definitely not yours to control." "No," he agreed, his hand sliding up to cup my jaw, his thumb tracing my lower lip. "I am yours. Every bone, every scar, every drop of blood. I am your servant, Thalia. Tell me what you want." The submission in his voice was the ultimate victory. The greatest enemy, the man who had terrified the Silverstone pack for a decade, was baring his soul to me. I leaned down, closing the gap, and the world outside, the threats, the fire, the pack, ceased to exist. But just as the tension finally snapped into a moment of pure romantic union, a sound cut through the heat of the cabin. It wasn't a howl or a whistle. It was the rhythmic, heavy clanking of iron chains being dragged across the porch. Chapter 13. The Morning of the Empress. The sun hadn't even cleared the iron spine peaks when I stepped out of the cedar chair, my body feeling heavy and electrified at the same time. The mate ache had been replaced by a deep, pulsing satisfaction, a biological anchor that made me feel like I was rooted into the very mountain. Rhodri was still in the chair, his head tilted back, his obsidian eyes watching my every move with a gaze of total, obsessed devotion. He looked like a man who had finally found his son. "The chains," I said, my voice raspy. I looked at the heavy iron shackles lying on the porch through the window. They didn't just leave a letter, they left a cage. "They won't use it," Rhodri said, rising from the chair. He looked different this morning, more centered, more lethal. The monster hadn't gone away, he had simply found a purpose. He walked over to me, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind and pulling me flush against his heat. "I will melt that iron into a throne before I let it touch your skin." "Oh, I'm not worried about the iron, Rhodri," I said, leaning my head back against his shoulder. "I'm worried about the timing. My father doesn't wait 3 days when he's already sent the chains. The letter was a distraction. He's already in the territory." Rhodri's growl was low and constant now, a subterranean warning. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling the scent of our union, a mix of wood smoke, rain, and the unmistakable musk of a claimed mate. "Let him come," Rhodri whispered. "He wants a disgrace. He'll find an empress." We spent the next few hours in a state of fierce, quiet preparation. I reorganized the cabin, setting the stage for the confrontation I knew was coming. I made Rhodri wear a dark, heavy coat, unbuttoned, of course, and I dressed in my finest sables, my hair pinned up with a silver dagger-shaped comb I'd found in the cedar wardrobe. I didn't look like a girl who had been thrown away. I looked like a woman who was about to deliver a verdict. The mountain was silent now, the geothermal thrumming having settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The charcoal wolf in the cellar was quiet, waiting. "They're here," Rhodri said suddenly, his body going rigid. I walked to the door and threw it open. The morning light was blinding against the snow, but I didn't flinch. At the edge of the clearing, a line of 20 Silverstone warriors stood, their gray coats stark against the white. In the center was my father, looking smaller than I remembered, his face a mask of ancient, stubborn pride. "Salia!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the valley. "Step away from the rogue. The chains are for him. Your carriage is waiting." I stepped onto the porch, my hand resting casually on the hilt of the silver comb in my hair. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him, letting the silence stretch until the warriors began to shift uncomfortably. "My carriage left 3 days ago, father," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the wind. "And as for the rogue, he's currently busy being the only man in this territory who knows how to bow." I stepped back, and Rhodri emerged from the shadows. He didn't roar, he didn't shift. He simply walked to the edge of the porch, and in front of the entire Silverstone lineage, he dropped to one knee. He bared his scarred, powerful throat to me, his head bowed, in a gesture of absolute, public submission. The gasp that went up from the warriors was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. My father's face went from pale to a terrifying, mottled red. "You," my father stammered, his hand shaking as he pointed at us, "you've corrupted the monster." "No, father," I said, a slow, fierce smile spreading across my lips. I just reminded him who he was waiting for. But as I looked down at the kneeling greatest enemy, a sound of 100 snapping branches echoed from the forest behind the Silverstone warriors. It wasn't the pack, it was something much, much larger. Chapter 14. The Forest's Roar. The crashing in the undergrowth sounded like the mountain itself was shedding its skin. My father's warriors, so arrogant a moment ago, scattered like leaves in a gale, their formation breaking as they scented the air. It wasn't just one predator, it was a tidal wave of biological power that made the Silverstone wolves look like house pets. Rhodri rose from his knee, his submission to me instantly replaced by the lethal focus of a mate defending his territory. He didn't shift, his human form was terrifying enough. He stood in front of me, a wall of muscle and scarred flesh, his growl a low, continuous thunder that vibrated through the porch floorboards. "Stay behind the timber," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "That isn't a pack, it's a migration." "Of what?" I asked, though I was already reaching for the heavy iron poker by the hearth. "Polar bears? Misguided elephants?" "Rogues," Rhodri spat, the word tasting like ash. "The bone-haired man's entire legion. They've come for the territory. They think the monster has gone soft." The tree line burst open, and a dozen men, no, creatures, spilled into the clearing. They were enormous, rugged, and smelled of nothing but cold iron and old blood. The leader, the bone-haired man I had threatened days ago, stood at the front, his eyes fixed on Rhodri with a hungry, triumphant sneer. My father, seeing a new threat that wasn't his disgrace of a daughter, saw an opportunity. He rallied his remaining warriors, forming a tenuous line against the rogues. "Rhodri!" my father shouted, his voice thick with desperation. "We must fight together. If they take the Iron Spine, they take the Southern Reach next." Rhodri didn't even look at him. He just stood there, his back to my father, his eyes locked on the bone-haired man. The biological weight of his presence was suffocating. He was the apex here, and every wolf in the clearing knew it. "Thalia is the sovereign of this mountain, and I am her only warrior. You are all trespassers." The bone-haired man laughed, a sharp, cracking sound. "A woman who can't even growl? You're pathetic, Rhodri. We'll take the cabin, we'll take the territory, and we'll take the tribute for ourselves." Rhodri didn't wait. He launched himself off the porch, a blur of raw, destructive power. He didn't fight with finesse, he fought like a natural disaster. He tackled the bone-haired man into the snow, their bodies a tangle of muscle and rage. My father's wolves hesitated, unsure whether to join the fight or flee. I stood on the porch, the iron poker heavy in my hand, watching the chaos. This wasn't my fight. This was a brawl between men who solved problems with their teeth. But as the bone-haired man pinned Rhodri to the ground, his hand reaching for his throat, I realized I was wrong. This was my mountain, and Rhodri was mine. Chapter 15. The Empress's Command. I didn't think, I didn't plan, I just moved. I leaped off the porch into the knee-deep snow, the iron poker gripped so tightly my knuckles were white. My father shouted my name, a useless, panicked sound that got lost in the wind. Rhodri was struggling under the weight of the bone-haired man, his strength sapped by the sheer numbers of the rogues pinning him down. The leader's fingers were digging into Rhodri's windpipe, a feral grin on his face. "Look at your champion, queen," the bone-haired man snarled at me. "He's nothing but a—" I didn't let him finish. I swung the iron poker with every ounce of disgrace I'd been saving up for 20 years. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening thwack that echoed across the clearing. The bone-haired man crumpled sideways, stunned but not unconscious. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with shock. You hit me." I can do more than hit you, I said, my voice ice cold, my breath pluming in the freezing air. I didn't growl, I didn't show my teeth. I just stood there, a woman in a wool dress with a fireplace tool, and let my biological scent, the nothing scent my father hated, pour into the clearing. The effect was instantaneous. Every rogue wolf froze. The scent wasn't aggressive, it was an absence of aggression, a vacuum of pure, calm authority that was more terrifying to their instincts than any alpha's roar. They looked at me, then at their fallen leader, and a wave of confusion washed over them. Rhodri shoved the bone-haired man off him and scrambled to his feet. He didn't attack, he immediately moved behind me, his hand on my back, projecting a dominant, possessive musk that reinforced my claim. We stood there, a two-person pack against an army. "You have two choices," I said, looking at the bone-haired man who was struggling to his knees. "You can leave my mountain now and tell everyone you meet that the monster is still very much alive. Or you can stay, and I'll let the wolf in my cellar out to play with you. He's much bigger than Rhodri, and he's very hungry." The bluff was insane, but the scent of the charcoal wolf in the cellar, that wild, ancient musk, was drifting from the vents, lending weight to my lie. The bone-haired man looked at me, then at Rhodri, and finally at the dark, foreboding cabin. He scrambled to his feet, his face pale. "This territory is cursed," he spat, backing away. "You're all cursed." He turned and ran into the trees, his rogues following close behind. The Silverstone wolves watched them go, their jaws slack. My father looked at me as if I had just sprouted a second head. Rhodri wrapped his arms around me from behind, burying his face in my neck. "You are absolutely terrifying," he whispered, his voice thick with a mix of relief and raw, worshipful lust, "and the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." I leaned back into him, the adrenaline crash hitting me hard. "I told you I wasn't a tribute, Rhodri." "No," he agreed, his lips brushing my ear. "You are an empress." We turned to face my father, who was looking at us with a strange mix of fear and calculation. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a single, mournful howl echoed from the cellar. The charcoal wolf, and this time it wasn't a warning, it was a plea. Chapter 16. The Father's Gambit. The howl from the cellar was a reminder that our problems were far from over. My father heard it too. The calculation in his eyes sharpened into a predatory focus. "You have a wild one down there," he said, his voice regaining its arrogant edge. "That's a violation of the High Council's law, Thalia. Harboring a feral rogue is punishable by death." "Father," I said, my voice weary but firm, "you just watched me single-handedly stop an invasion with a fireplace poker. Do you really think I care about the Council's laws?" "You should," he retorted, stepping closer, "because I can make you the rogue issue disappear. I can reinstate your name in the lineage. All you have to do is come back to Silverstone and marry the Gold Leaf Alpha." Rhodri's growl was instantaneous, a low, dangerous vibration against my spine. He started to move forward, but I held up a hand to stop him. "You're still trying to sell me," I said, looking at my father with a sudden, profound pity. "You just saw the man who would burn the world down for me, and you're still trying to trade me for political favor. You really don't understand what loyalty is, do you?" "Loyalty?" my father scoffed. "That is a beast, Thalia, a rogue. He will tire of you or he will turn on you. The pack is the only thing that lasts." "The pack is a lie you tell yourself to justify your cruelty," I said. "Rhodri isn't a beast. He is my mate, and this mountain is my home. Now, take your warriors and leave. If I see any of you on the Iron Spine again, I won't be using a poker." My father stared at me for a long moment. He looked at Rhodri, whose eyes were glowing with a lethal, protective fire. He looked at the retreating rogues in the distance. He knew he had lost. "You are making a mistake," he said, his voice cold. "You will regret this, Thalia. When the winter comes and the rogue forgets you, you will wish you were back in the hall." "I already regret 20 years of listening to you," I replied. He turned and signaled to his warriors. They began to retreat down the mountain, their tails tucked between their legs. I watched them go, feeling the weight of my past finally, truly lifting. I turned to Rhodri. He was looking down at me, his eyes full of a raw, naked emotion I had never seen before. He reached out and cupped my face, his thumbs tracing my cheekbones. "You chose me," he whispered, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "In front of everyone, you chose the monster." "I chose the man who saw me when no one else did," I said, leaning into his touch. He let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and pulled me into a kiss that was desperate, hungry, and full of promises. The cold air around us seemed to vanish, replaced by the sweltering heat of our bond. But as we stood there in the snow, lost in each other, the ground beneath us gave another violent shudder. A cloud of steam erupted from the vents near the cabin, and the howl from the cellar changed. It wasn't a plea anymore, it was a scream of pain. The mountain was waking up, and it wasn't happy. Chapter 17. The Bared Throat. The steam wasn't just a cloud, it was a physical weight, thick with the scent of sulfur, wet cedar, and the raw, ancient pulse of the mountain. My father's warriors had stopped their retreat at the edge of the clearing, frozen by the sight of the iron spine literally breathing fire. They looked like terrified ants watching a giant wake up. "The vents," Rhodri rasped, his hand tightening on mine so hard I could feel his pulse jumping in his palm. "Thalia, the pressure in the cellar, the wolf isn't just screaming, he's the anchor. If he breaks, the mountain breaks." "Of course he is," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even as the ground beneath my boots buckled again. I didn't wait for Rhodri to lead the way. I bolted back toward the cabin, my fine sables catching on the splintered doorframe. The heat inside was staggering, a sweltering wall of humidity that made the silk of my undergarments cling to my skin. The thrumming was so loud now, it felt like my own heart was being played like a drum. Rhodri was right behind me, his chest heaving. We hit the cellar stairs together. The stone walls were sweating, and the charcoal wolf was no longer pacing. He was pinned against the back of the iron grate, his massive body trembling as the geothermal heat vented directly beneath his paws. He wasn't a prisoner, he was a lightning rod for the mountain's excess energy. "He's absorbing the surge," Rhodri whispered, his obsidian eyes wide with a mix of horror and understanding. "He's an elder, Thalia, exiled because he was too grounded, too tied to the earth. The Silverstone Pack threw him away decades ago for being too slow, just like they threw you away for being too quiet." "Well, the slow and the quiet are about to save everyone's lives," I snapped, though my heart was breaking for the animal. I didn't reach for a tool or a key. I walked straight to the iron bars, ignoring the way the heat scorched my lungs. I didn't growl. I didn't command. I simply pressed my palms against the hot iron and let my scent, that honeyed, iron-rich nothing that defined my soul, flood the cramped space. "Rhodri, touch me," I commanded. "I need your heat. I need the bond to anchor him." Rhodri didn't hesitate. He stepped up behind me, his bare, scarred chest flushing against my back, his arms wrapped around my waist, his hands covering mine on the bars. The contact was explosive. The mate ache snapped into a focused beam of pure biological power. It wasn't a magical glow, it was a physical resonance. The charcoal wolf's eyes locked onto mine, and the frantic screaming stopped. The wolf let out a long, low huff, his muscles finally relaxing as our combined scent, the alpha's dominance and the sovereign's calm, provided a stable frequency for his system to mimic. The mountain's shuddering slowed. The steam began to recede. But as the pressure eased, I felt Rhodri shift behind me. He wasn't just holding me, he was vibrating with a terrifying, absolute reverence. He pulled me back from the bars and turned me in his arms. His face was a mask of raw, romantic agony. "You are the only thing holding this mountain together," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You aren't just my mate, Thalia. You are the queen of the Iron Spine." He didn't wait for us to get back to the porch. He led me out into the snow, right into the center of the clearing, where my father and the Silverstone warriors were still watching in stunned silence. The steam was still curling around us like ghosts. Rhodri looked at my father, then at the warriors who had called me a disgrace. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, he sank to both knees in the freezing mud. He tilted his head back, baring his powerful, scarred throat to the sky, and to me. It was the ultimate submission. The greatest enemy was publicly handing his life to the woman they had discarded. "Thalia!" my father screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "You will not permit this! It is an abomination!" But before I could speak, the bone-haired man's melodic whistle echoed from the forest again, followed by the heavy, rhythmic beat of 100 war drums. The rogues hadn't left. They had been waiting for the mountain to stop shaking. Chapter 18. The Sovereign Union. The drums were a bit much, honestly. If the bone-haired man wanted to make an entrance, a simple knock would have sufficed, but apparently rogue etiquette demanded a percussion section. I stood there on the mud-slicked porch, the steam from the mountain curling around my skirts like a living thing, while the greatest enemy of the territory remained on his knees at my feet. "Rhodri, get up," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rhythmic thumping of the rogue army. "Your knees are going to be bruised, and you're blocking the view of my father's impending nervous breakdown." Rhodri didn't move. He kept his head bowed, his scarred throat bared to the gray sky. "I stay where I belong, Thalia, at the feet of the woman who saved the mountain." "Well, you're currently belonging in the way of a potential invasion," I muttered, though the warmth in my chest was enough to melt every snowflake between here and the Silverstone Hall. The bone-haired man stepped into the clearing, followed by 100 men who looked like they hadn't seen a bar of soap since the previous century. They stopped 10 paces from my father's trembling warriors. The air didn't just feel heavy, it felt like it was made of lead. The biological pull of so many alphas in one space usually resulted in a bloodbath, but something was different today. They weren't looking at my father, they weren't even looking at Rhodri, they were looking at me, and the way the most lethal man in the marches was worshipping the woman the world had called a disgrace. "You came for a fight?" I asked, my voice cutting through the drumming like a blade. I stepped forward, placing my hand on Rhodri. The heat of him surged through me, a biological current that felt like iron and honey. "Because if you're looking for the monster, he's currently occupied, but if you're looking for a sovereign, you're looking at her." I didn't growl. I didn't need to. I let my scent, the calm, grounded aroma of cedar and rain, flood the clearing. It wasn't a challenge. It was a verdict. It was the scent of a home that wouldn't be broken. The rogue leader looked at Rhodri's bared throat. He looked at the way I stood, unafraid of the 100 predators before me. In the shifter world, strength wasn't always about who had the sharpest teeth. It was about who had the most to lose and the iron will to keep it. Slowly, the rogue leader stopped his drumming. He didn't growl. He didn't shift. He simply lowered his head in a short, sharp nod of recognition. "The mountain has spoken. We do not hunt where the sovereign rules." He turned, his men following him back into the shadows of the Iron Spine. They didn't want a war with a woman who had tamed the monster and the mountain in the same breath. My father tried to speak, his face a mask of humiliated rage. "Thalia, this is over, father," I interrupted, my voice fierce and final. "Take your warriors, take your shame, and never breathe my air again. The Silverstone Pack has no daughter here, only a queen." I watched them retreat until the clearing was silent, save for the crackling of the logs in our hearth. Rhodri finally rose, his eyes dark with a raw, romantic obsession. He didn't say a word, he just picked me up and carried me back into the sweltering sanctuary of our cabin. The door clicked shut, the world outside finally, truly gone. Rhodri pressed me against the cedar wall, his hands tangling in my hair, his lips hovering an inch from mine. "I am yours," he groaned, the sound a deep, vibrating promise. "Every mountain, every breath, every heartbeat, I am your mate, Thalia." "And I am your empress," I whispered, pulling him down into a kiss that tasted of victory and forever. The pack Disgrace was dead. The sovereign had come home.